good to be alive in this land of ours. Good to drive in this land of ours.
Hello, Canada hockey fans in the United States.
Now, a special telecast of the Canada-Russia hockey game, direct from Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto.
It's been a sensational hockey game, and Whitby leads 5-2, but it's been one of the most exciting games by far, certainly of this year, and perhaps for a long time to come, and it's had about everything, clean as a whip, and full of action all the way.
65 years ago this winter season, a major milestone. The first time a hockey team from Russia came to Canada to play a series of games. Hello, everyone. I'm Glenn Dreyfus. Welcome to Hockey Time Machine. Canadian Prime Minister John Diefenbacher had been in office just 2 months when he got this letter. It was from the Canadian Amateur Hockey Association. The August 1957 letter advised that, quote, arrangements have been made for such a visit with a Russian team subject to approval. One thing that hasn't changed in the last 65 years is that when it comes to sporting competition between nations, it isn't just about the games. The Moscow Select Team began its Canadian tour just 12 years after the end of World War II, during the early years of the Cold War and the early years of the space race. Here is a quick primer on the 1957 launch of the Soviet satellite Sputnik that happened at the same time, and the real and perceived implications back in North America.
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket. Here, an artist's conception of how the feat was accomplished. A 3-stage rocket. Number 1, the booster in the class of an intercontinental missile. Its weight estimated at 50 tons. The smaller second stage took over at 5,000 miles an hour and carried on to the highest point reached. 500 miles up, the artificial moon is boosted to a speed counterbalancing the pull of gravity and released.
Early satellites will investigate temperature of outer space. They will use thermistors in order to do this. These thermistors are very delicate devices which will register very slight changes in temperature. Then also we will have weathermen will put photoelectric cells into some of the satellites, and these will give us some idea of cloud cover all over the Earth in a very short length of time. And then we shall also have the atomic scientists investigating the nature of cosmic particles.
The Soviets said the kind of rockets which have taken Sputnik up could also carry nuclear weapons in space.
America said, now wait a minute, Russians can't even build a refrigerator. What are they doing putting a Sputnik, a satellite, into orbit?
We fear this.
Russia wins dominance of this completely new area? Well, I think the consequences are fairly plain. Probable Soviet world domination.
The people of the United States have been humiliated, they're disturbed, and they're unhappy.
For the record, we Americans are still disturbed and unhappy. We're joined by Paul Patsku. And Paul, as a historian, before we get to the social situation and the political situation at this time and surrounding the series, how did you uncover the footage and find out about this tour?
Well, it was before I started to become a hockey historian, so I didn't really know a lot about this particular game. But one day, a reel was 16 millimeter reel was found, a kinescope in someone's garage, and it said special. It's Hockey Night in Canada broadcast, but it had a Friday date on it. So that didn't make any sense because they never ever did a Hockey Night in Canada other than the Saturday night. So I wanted to find out what was so special about this, and boy, did I ever, because at the time, newspaper headlines were Soviets were going to take over and they're going to send Sputnik up. They're going to do all these things, and it was a scary time. Now, I remember a few years later, in '62, Cuban Missile Crisis, we were taken down to the basement in public school for a bomb shelter. We were practicing that. So that's the type of atmosphere that was happening at the time when these mysterious Russian players came over. And so it intrigued my interest, and it was a big deal at the time. It really was.
For people who don't know, the Dunlops were a senior team. What does a senior team, what does that mean, and what types of players did they have, and how does that relate to the National Hockey League?
Well, at that time, up into the 60s, senior hockey was a major deal in Canada. The Allen Cup winners, then they represented Canada World Championships, and they had a lot of really good teams. There were former pros playing, and it was good hockey, and they were in small towns, and they were supported by those towns, and it was they got a lot of press back then. It's not like it is now. You don't hear anything about senior hockey now, but it was on a par with junior hockey, and some players actually played in the NHL before and after this particular game.
One journalist called the Russian team the Sputnik Puckniks, and an article in the game program by Bob Hesketh, the game between Whitby and the Moscow Selects, Hesketh's article started this way, quote, "It will be surprising to a lot of people tonight to discover that Russian hockey players have one head and the usual complement of arms, legs, ears, eyes, and fingers." Alex Braverman joins us now, along with Paul and Sean Mitten. Alex recently published a book on the 1972 Summit Series, when Canada shut down. But Alex, this series was 15 years before 72, and the Russian players were viewed as mysterious, as if they were coming from Mars.
Yes, correct. We have special names for 1972 series, when Canadians call it Summer Summit and Soviets call it Super Series. But the series we refer to now, probably forgotten series. Everybody, some people forget about it, but some people didn't know anything about it. And I just discovered it when I was working on a book about Summer Summit. So very interesting stories, and have different layers, which we discovered together with Paul and other people. And hopefully it will be interesting to you.
Paul, the Russian team and the people around the Russian team, they were quite a curiosity to the people in Canada.
They sure were. Nobody knew anything about them. Some fans would know because they lost to the Russians. Canada lost to the Russians in 54. They won in 50. Canada won in 55. They lost in 56. So there's some knowledge, but this is the first time they actually came to Canada. So people can actually see them up close and get some real press. And because no one knew anything about the players individually, they just wanted to see what they're all about. And like I said, it was that climate of Cold War that these people were enemies of Canada and the U.S., and they're coming over here to play our game.
Alex, one of the Russian coaches kept a diary, and we're actually taking a look at some of the pages from that diary. It talks about the team flying first to Germany from Russia, then on to Scotland, and finally an 8-hour trip across the Atlantic before landing at 3 a.m. in Gander, Newfoundland. 11 hours later, the diary says, they were practicing at an indoor rink, which local fans came to watch. Alex, what else do you know about this diary?
Yeah, the diary tell us many interesting things, but also these three, the flight was supposed to come to States first, and for some reason they were turned down, and not for some reason, for because of the Cold War and Sputnik, I guess. They were revised, and they landed in Canada, and the trip in total took them 36 hours, and right after, because of the layoff on the first stop, about 11 hours. Tarasov couldn't still sit, and he asked if is there a rink around here, and they told me yes, it is one, and he asked for practice to be arranged, and somebody on Canadian side decided, why not? We can arrange the practice, and we can even charge the fans to participate, to look at the practice, and they collect a bunch of money at that point, and. What funny was at the end of the practice, somebody came over to Tarasov and said, "Here's a half of proceeds, and it's yours." And Tarasov, he couldn't take this money because KGB was watching, and he was afraid to take this money. So he said, "No, it's not mine. I didn't do anything to earn it." They said, "No, you help us. It's yours." To make story short, he didn't take the money, and they fly back, not back to Montreal, and then to Toronto. So they were not ready for the first game, I guess.
But a triumph of Canadian capitalism, charging to watch the practice. Paul, one of the highlights for the Russian contingent was them as spectators at an NHL game in Toronto between the Blackhawks and the Maple Leafs. This is a newspaper photo of a quartet of Russian players watching the game from the stands. Do you know any more about their visit to Maple Leaf Gardens to watch the game?
Well, it was traditional for European teams come over and they would play Maple Leaf Gardens, but they also would watch a game. And every hockey night in Canada telecast, around that time, they would show them up in the stand. They had an orchestra back then, like a space for the band in one end of the gardens, and that's where they would put them. And so they would announce them to the crowd, and and they would watch the game and get their impressions afterwards. Being the first time Maple Leaf Gardens and Canada and watching an NHL game, it was kind of interesting to hear their views, and some of the views were linked to 72, and we'll get to talk about that later too.
In a statement after the tour, Russian officials had high praise for their Canadian amateur opponents, especially the goalies they faced. But of the NHL variety of hockey, they said, quote, "The games usually have a ruthless character. Players resort to means that inflict pain on their opponents." So, Paul, I guess it was fair to say there was some amount of culture shock on both sides.
Yeah, the game that they viewed was the Chicago Blackhawks versus the Leafs in November '57. And they weren't used to seeing fights on the ice and things like that. So it was a culture shock to them. And it was after they already played Whitby. So it's not like they would be scared to play them because of fighting, because their game was already over. But they sure opened their eyes a bit. That's for sure.
Alex, it's fair to point out that back in 1957, hockey had only been played in the Soviet Union for about a decade or so, right?
Yep. It started in 1947. They just celebrate 75th anniversary of Russian hockey. And actually at 1957, it was like a turning point for the team because the older generation of hockey players were ready to retire. Tarasov was kind of experimenting on this trip. He took players from different emplois and different teams and different physical features, and he was measuring them against Canadian players and trying to see which style of game would be working better against Canadian. And his dream I mean, I'm talking about Anatoly Tarasov. Dream was always to play against Canadians, and that was the beginning of 1957.
In the second intermission of the Whitby Russian game, TV viewers got a peek behind the hockey Iron Curtain. Here is a portion of an interview with Colonel Pavel Korotkov, chairman of the Soviet Ice Hockey Federation, along with his translator.
Do the players play hockey 12 months a year? Do they do anything else?
He said, of course, our boys are not playing 12 months a year, but during the last before the last 2 years, we played only 3 or 4 months. Now we had several artificial ice rinks. That's why we are playing about 6 months a year.
Для наших всех игроков хоккей не является профессией.
And the ice hockey is not a job for the boys.
В составе команды служащие, студенты, техники.
We have among the boys servicemen, officers and soldiers, and white collars, and students, and some other professions.
Colonel, what time of life, that is, what age does the average Soviet boy start to play hockey?
As for the boys who are playing right now, some of them are playing from 4 years to 8 or 10 years. But as for the boys, they usually start playing in the organized hockey since 13 years of age. We have 2 types of brands of hockey.
До того, как начали играть в хоккей,
Before we started playing ice hockey with puck,
играли только в хоккей с мячом или баней.
we played with a ball that it is known in the Scandinavian countries as bandy.
Oh, yes. И до настоящего времени в хоккей-бенди у нас играет все-таки больше молодежи, чем в хоккей
And he
шайбой.
said that the bandy hockey is more popular in Russia and more people, young people, are playing bandy.
Но
с каждым
годом хоккей с шайбой приобретает все большую
But with
популярность.
every year to come, the ice hockey with the puck, is getting more and more popular.
I love that.
All that tickled you, right?
Well, it sure does, because that's the first year Hockey Night Canada actually had intermission guests. Before that was a hot stove. And you see, Scott Young, famous Canadian writer, father of Neil Young, who everybody knows, and Wes McKnight, the famous radio personality. It was an awkward intermission for them to ask them questions. Now, later on, you can tell that the colonel there, he really understood English, but it was interesting how the interpreter, I don't know what if the colonel was saying exactly what the interpreter interpreted, but it was uncomfortable for everyone, and especially when Scott Young asked the colonel, why are some of the players wearing toques on the ice? And the colonel says, well, that's not really important.
I noticed that some of your players who started the game with the little toques, including down over their ears, discarded them during the first period or so.
Он говорит о том, что он заметил, как некоторые наши игроки начинали игру в шапочках, они ее сняли во втором периоде.
Да, но это значения не имеет в данном случае.
Well, this is not so important, of course.
Next question.
Incidentally, at the time Colonel Korotkov was doing that interview, his younger brother was otherwise occupied. Alexander Korotkov in 1957 held the rank of Major General with the KGB. And on the subject of spying, during the Russian tour, the Mounties were doing some of their own. We direct your attention to this letter, for example, from the O Division of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who had been tailing a Russian embassy officer named Svetkov. The subject, quote, was not observed talking to anyone who harbored communist sympathies. Well, that's a relief. Alex, we mentioned Sputnik earlier. It also appeared in a newspaper cartoon depicting Canadian skaters in a sleigh.
The Wolves were Canadian players because the name of the team they play that day was Wolves.
Sudbury Wolves.
Yeah, so the Russian players were sitting and Wolves were chasing them, and I guess it was referred to, to speed and quality of game of Russians, and the question was, could Wolves beat them at the game or not?
Alex, what was your understanding of how well this series was known and is known inside Russia? I know the same broadcast that was televised in Canada was also televised in the Soviet Union.
As of today, the footage of the series is it's available, just a portion of it, I guess, on YouTube or other channels, but not every game's available. And the main things, the series was designed to be to have only 7 games, and I guess because of the popularity of the games, Maple Leaf Gardens was full, other arenas were full. So they added extra game to the series just to have more of Russians or more enjoyable games for Canadian players.
Right, because there was originally scheduled to be a 7-game series and ended up being 8. Paul, as Alex had mentioned, the travel initially put the Moscow team at a disadvantage, but the Canadian teams they played were also at a disadvantage because all the games were played under European rules.
Yeah, they weren't. Whitby wasn't used to that. The European rules were slightly different, like no icing the puck on during killing penalties, or no body checking in the offensive zone, and things like that. That took a bit of adjusting, but not really. Although it's interesting that the game started off in the first few minutes at 2-0 for the Russians. And can you imagine what people in Maple Leaf Gardens were thinking at that point? Ironically, 15 years later, and Foster Hewitt's doing the games again, and it's Canada 2-0. It's a reverse where Canada gets beaten, and a lot of similarities between 57 and 72. Harry Sinden was the star player for Whitby, and then we've got him coaching in 72. Lots of things like that.
Let me ask both of you guys as a final question in this segment. What are the implications for the 72 Summit Series that came out of this 1957 tour? Alex, why don't you start?
I believe the series helped Soviet program discover different technique Canadian players using during the game. They opened the eyes for physicality of the games, and it's kind of prepared them for a future series. And don't forget that Tarasov was head of coach of Soviet teams all these years from starting before 57 and up to 72, and only because of some politics or other facts, he wasn't coach at the Super Series or Summer Summit, but his ideas and his things he picked up at the first series, it helped to prepare the team for the future.
Paul, do you think 57 in some ways laid the groundwork for 72?
It did. Actually, it laid the groundwork for the World Championships in Oslo a few months later, and Canada won that. And so this particular game would have helped the Whitby team know what they were up against. And so that helped. And also put Whitby, a small town east of Toronto, on the map, because Whitby Dunlops, named after the Dunlops Tire Company, they were national heroes now. Even if it was one game that they win, and then they win the World Championship. So Whitby Dunlops is something historically important in Canadian history. Now, as far as 72 goes, well, interesting when Harry Sinden showed video of that game to the 72 players in training camp, they didn't take it very seriously. They were laughing at the equipment and the play and all that. And, probably wasn't the wisest thing for Harry to show them, especially since they had video of the Russians in the 60s. But no, I don't know if it prepared the players in 72. Although Sinden would have been affected, he would have known how good they were, but he couldn't convince his players. 15-year difference. Russians have sure improved. They found out in game 1 in Montreal.
Paul, we're going to bring you back at the end of the program to talk more about the Dunlops and the 1958 World Championships. And so don't go anywhere. And Alex, thank you very much for sharing your insights. And later on, we're also going to show an interview with one of the Russian players who participated in the tour from 57. So thank you for that and for joining us to help educate us about the Russian side of things.
Thank you for having me, and enjoy the show.
We need to dive into the meeting between the Dunnies and the Moscow Selects, and we'll do that with 3 of the players who were actually on the ice for that game. The first is a Hall of Famer, Harry Sinden. In the dictionary under Hockey Lifer is Harry's picture. From Sinden's bantam days with the Toronto Marlboros in the 1940s, coaching the Bruins to a Stanley Cup in 1970, coaching Team Canada to victory in the 72 Summit Series, returning to the Bruins as general manager for a remarkable 28 years, and at the age of 90, still a senior advisor for Boston. But before becoming a sports legend in New England, Sinden was a star defenseman and captain of the Whitby Dunlops in the OHA Senior League. How aware was the team about the buzz surrounding the game? 14,000 people in the stands, Foster Hewitt and his TV audience. Do you remember beforehand being loose, being tight? What was the mood?
Well, the whole thing was a bit of a mystery to us, the players on that team. We weren't front and center with the Toronto Maple Leaf Garden crowd. It's where the Maple Leafs played. In fact, that's the first time many of us ever played there. But I think we were shocked to see the number of people that came and how enthusiastic they were. But I think the fact that everything was so mysterious about the Russian team, how they played, what they looked like, how their equipment was, and everything else, that it got an awful lot of interest.
Then you fall behind quickly, 2-0. But by the end of the first period, Whitby has poured in the next 5 goals. So take me through that roller coaster of a first period.
Well, it was very shocking because the goals were beautiful that they scored. Really complete passing plays and a good shot to finish on both of them. I was on the ice for the first one. I think the first 2 goals only took 58 seconds, as I recall. And we kind of felt we had to change our style and become a little more checking conscious, and not let them have so much room once they got the puck. Because if you gave that team room, and many Russian and Soviet teams after that, the same thing applied. If you gave them what they referred to as time and space, they were dynamite. They made all the right plays. They could pick up the passes as well as we could, or better. So once we decided that checking was going to be the key element to play against them, things got a lot better.
You were also playing under the European rules. Did that cause any type of playing style change for you or some getting used to?
There's a couple of things. I can't remember what they were right now, but I don't think they caused a lot of problems.
Whitby had a powerhouse team, 27-6-3 in 57-58. The next season, 33-11-8. What made the team so good?
Well, there were only 6 teams in the National Hockey League at the time. So a lot of players didn't pursue a hockey career unless they felt certain they could reach the National Hockey League. Unlike today, we got over 700 players in the National Hockey League. In those days, there would be at the most 110. So there were a lot of good players that didn't leave Canada, even to begin a minor league career with the hopes of getting to the NHL, because the road was too difficult to find a spot for many, many young Canadian boys in a 6-team NHL league. So they stayed home. They got a job and they stayed home. Senior hockey was a tremendous brand, both out west and in Quebec and in Ontario. So it was a tremendous brand of hockey that you could stay home for. So we ended up with a lot of players who were very, very good players. I don't know if they could have played in the NHL, but in today's environment, they would have pursued a career towards the NHL. In those days, many, many boys, didn't do that. They couldn't do it. They had to stay and work, but they wanted to play hockey, so they ended up working and playing hockey, and these great senior leagues were formed. Tremendous competition and some really great players and some great teams, and Whitby was one of them.
Were you aware of the political background, the launching of Sputnik and the space race and the Cold War and so on? Or were you and your teammates just concentrating on playing a game?
No, we were aware of it. Maybe not as much as you would be those things today. The social media had not evolved yet. And, even TV broadcasting was not as wide as it is now. So we were aware of it and understood it. But, when it came to playing hockey, just like the Russian team, they just wanted to play. And that first game was remarkably good.
In 1958, it's on to the World Championships. And here's a memory I apologize for mentioning. The ocean liner you took to Oslo. I read this team was sick for a week.
Yes, well, not everybody, but a lot of the players were, and seasick, and we tried everything. And the first morning, I remember at breakfast, the entire team was there, and the next morning there wasn't anybody. It was rugged. It was really rugged. We tried to work out, in the gym on the ship. And that didn't, it helped some people, but not many.
What do you remember about your European tour? 14 exhibition games that you played on the way to the World Championships.
Well, I remember many of the teams really weren't of the level we were, and so the games were competitively were pretty easy for us, and we got very curious crowds at all the rinks. Some of them were outdoor rinks without a roof on them. The weather was cold, and it was a great experience to go through those games to begin with. The Dunlop Tire Company wanted us to play in a lot of the cities where they had a plant and a lot of employees, and we did that.
And the Dunnies continued that dominance once you got to Norway, winning all 7 of your tournament games. In fact, there's a picture of you, a newspaper picture of you scoring the 22nd goal in what would be a 24-0 rout of Finland. Were you surprised that the games were also one-sided?
Yeah, the final game was not, of course.
Right.
And Sweden, we expected a much closer game than that. I think it was 10-something we won. But the final game against the Russians, 4-2, it was as close as it gets.
In fact, the final game was tied, the gold medal game, 2-2 through 2 periods. So what do you recall about that third period when you, Whitby, and Canada pulled it out 4-2?
Well, we had 4 or 5 really star players. Bobby Addersley, Sandy Ayres, as a matter of fact, Bus Gagnon. Maybe I can include myself with that group. And we actually played well and scored. Addersley, I think, got at least one of the 2 goals in the third period, maybe both. He was the finest center anywhere outside of the NHL. He was kind of a small guy, but he was really good, really good. He was the spark plug of our team.
How much, if any, did your first game at Maple Leaf Gardens against a Russian team prepare you for the gold medal rematch?
Well, it was played on 2 different size ice surfaces, and that makes a tremendous difference how you can play. The difference in square footage of ice in Europe is a lot bigger than it is in North America. So you have to play a little different game. You can't get as close to the team in the checking game as you can here in North America. So we had to realize that the skating game and the pace of the game, well, was a lot different than it was in the physical way that we play in North America. So that change had to be made, and we learned that. We learned that in a hurry, not just against the Russians, but the Swedes and the Czechs too.
I read that the sweaters you wore at the Worlds kind of became your good luck charm the next season, that the team wore them, the Dunnies did, during the 58-59 season. Do you recall that?
I think that's right. I think that's right. I kind of forgot about that, but you're right. I got some photos upstairs with those jerseys on. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a photo too of you accepting the trophy and kissing it, that in Oslo was a picture that made it into all the Canadian newspapers back home.
Well, that was one of the proudest moments I've ever had in hockey, because a goodly number of Canadian soldiers had made their way up from Germany for that game, and they were in the stands. So, it was pretty, it was a tearful time. We were so happy, and the game was hard to win. We weren't walking away with anything, and the fact that all those Canadian soldiers were there, it made it a special time.
In 59, Whitby repeats as Allen Cup champions, but sadly, senior hockey, I guess, was in decline because the Dunnies actually folded in 1960. So how aware were you and the team that there were dark clouds forming in a financial sense?
Well, I knew that because the NHL started the EPHL, which was a league that required a certain number of players to be no older than, I think it was 24 years of age. It was a real development league for the NHL, and it was all across Ontario and Quebec. And that kind of spelled the end of senior hockey once that started. At that level, I mean, senior hockey survived, but not at the level it was in those years.
When did it kind of occur to you that coaching might be your path to the NHL?
Well, Lynn Patrick was the general manager of the Boston Bruins at the time. Great name in hockey. And he and the Canadians picked me up to play for them in their playoffs in a professional league. And Lynn Patrick would go, I was working at the time in Oshawa. And I had to travel back and forth to games that were both in Sudbury, that was our opponent, and our home ice was Hull, Ottawa. On those trips, and they were mostly by train, Lynn Patrick was there. He'd go up to the game and come back after it, just like I had to go to work. He was scouting the NHL playoffs. I think it was Detroit and Toronto. So those games were on the day after our game. So he was able to watch us play and scout the two teams and then get back in time and watch the NHL playing. So on those trips after a game, especially from Sudbury, was quite a long time, I would be getting on the train with him. He'd be going down to watch the next game, Toronto and Detroit, and I'd be going back to work. And we talked a lot about hockey. And I think he got the idea just from talking to me that I'd be interested in coaching. And the junior rink in hockey in Oshawa had burned down, and there was talks of a new rink, and they were going to put the team back in there. And would I be interested in coaching it, the junior team? And I said I thought I would. I was working at General Motors then in Oshawa. That never occurred, but they started a professional league called the Eastern Professional Hockey League, and it kind of destroyed the senior hockey at the level it was being played by teams like Whitby Dunlops. And Boston's team in that league was Kingston. And Lynn Patrick, after those associations on the train during the playoffs, invited me to play for Kingston, the Kingston Frontenacs in that league, and eventually become the coach, which happened. Ren Blair was the general manager and kind of pseudo coach. And then I eventually took over as a coach of the team too. And that started my coaching career. I was a player coach for Kingston for a few years. We won a championship too. The league moved to the Midwest, and the Bruins team from Kingston went to Minneapolis, and I went with it as a coach and a player for a couple of years. And after that, we moved around, went to Oklahoma City with the Bruins farm team, and then from there to Boston.
And you win a Stanley Cup in Boston in 1970. In 1972, you were a free agent. How surprised were you that you were tabbed to be the coach for Team Canada in the Summit Series?
Well, as I said at the time, I was the only one available that might fit that role. Everybody else was at training camp with their teams. So, I just been fortunate enough to be the coach of the Stanley Cup winning team. And they thought I perhaps could do that job. Alan Eagleson was the main force behind that. And I thought a great opportunity to get back into hockey. I was in private business at the time. So things fell into place for me there.
Did you have any idea of the intrigue you were about to get yourself into?
No, not to the degree it. I was interested. I'd played the Russians in the World Championships, and I knew how good they were. In fact, I was one of the only people on the 72 team that had any information about them at all. I knew how good they were, and I knew it would be a challenge, even though I think at the beginning the NHL players were kind of overconfident. But I knew it was going to be terrific, and eventually it became, because we lost a couple of games, and Canadian hockey fans were so disappointed. They kind of turned against the team a little bit, and because after all, it's our game in Canada, and that changed the players' attitude towards playing these games, and they were a much better team after that.
I understand at one point you actually showed some video of your 1957 game at Maple Leaf Gardens to the 72 squad.
I did that to see if they can get a sense of it. I probably made a mistake because they could see me playing in it too. So anyway, the film wasn't very good, and it was black and white and on a large scale ice surface, and they were kind of laughing at the whole thing. So I shut it off before it got worse. But I did it really not to give them an example of how the Russians played or to just illustrate to them how important games that they were going to play in were so important to Canadians. And then after we won that tournament and the presentation of the cup was made, as I said before, the Canadian soldiers, a lot of them were there. I felt it would be a good thing to show them what this tournament would mean in 72, just as it did in 57.
We just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Summit Series, which, as you well know, was hailed all over Canada. It's also the 65th anniversary of an event very few remember, the first game against Russia on Canadian soil. Since you were part of both, how do you size up those two events?
The first one was a definite mystery to our players and our fans as to what to expect. And, to get 2 goals in the first 58 seconds against you on beautiful, beautiful hockey plays left us pretty bewildered. But we did change our style a little bit and relied on the checking game to play better, as I said before. The games in the World Championships, no, that was, where did we go? 57. I get these years mixed up. 57 is when we played in Toronto, right? Yeah.
Right.
Right. And what was the other one you talked about? The first one in the World Championships?
Well, yes, that, and then comparing that with 72.
Yeah, well, by that time, which was, 57 to 72, is 15 years. The players on the Canadian team really had no contact with the Russians. The Russians had won the World Championship for many years in a row after that. And they had no contact and really didn't think that the tournament, this contest with the Russians would be any problem for them until that game in Montreal, and then it all ended.
Paul Patsku has pointed out that just as the Russians went up 2-0 in sudden fashion against Whitby, the Team Canada in the first game went up 2-0 real quick, and that lead didn't last either. So I guess it really is true about that dreaded 2-0 lead in hockey.
Yeah, that points it out for sure. I think our goaltenders, both Ken Dryden and Tony Esposito, had to become accustomed to, a big part of being a good goaltender is reading the play before it happens. So you're ready to move as you read the play, whether they're going to shoot it or pass it. In the NHL, the rule of thumb is shoot first, pass second. In other words, if there's no shot, pass it. Don't look to pass, and if there's no pass, try and shoot it because it's too late. So the Russians played it that way. They passed much more, from just outside the goal crease and around that area.
There's a photo of you at the 25th anniversary reunion of the Whitby Dunlops celebrating your successes in 57 and 58. Where do your Whitby accomplishments, you touched on this earlier, but the 2 Allen Cups and the World Championships in a storied hockey career, Harry, where do those memories rank among your hockey highlights?
Well, if I could choose more than one episode in my career, it certainly would be one of the 2 number ones. I mean, to me, the experience with Whitby, going to Europe the way we did, going through the experience in Toronto with the Russian team, Soviet team in those days for the first time, and establishing the Whitby Dunlops as a pretty damn good team in the legacy and history of Canadian hockey. I'd have to put it, right at the top of at least my experiences. It was all the guys on the team worked during the daytime, played at night. Sometimes had to go to work the next day after playing. Of course, this didn't happen during the World Championships. Their employers, including mine, General Motors, gave me time off for that. But during the regular season in our league, that's what everybody did. Everybody had a job and played hockey at night.
So you would rank the Summit Series and your Whitby accomplishments kind of 1A and 1B?
Well, yeah, and then I have to include the Stanley Cup here in Boston. We've never won it for, 40 years.
It was 29 years in 1970 when you won it. So that also was quite an accomplishment.
Yeah, that was a really big hit there. That was Bobby Orr's second year, and he was everything to the league at the time. And it was a special team, and to win it after those 29 years. I mean, we beat an expansion team in the Stanley Cup Finals, St. Louis. But if you recall, the NHL was split in 2 divisions. The 6 teams that were already playing, the 6 original teams, stayed for that first year as a singular division, and the 6 expansion teams formed a second division. So in order to play for the Stanley Cup, you had to beat, just as if you were playing for the Stanley Cup any other year, you had to beat 2 teams from your own division. And we had to beat the Rangers and the Blackhawks. And even though the series against St. Louis was much easier for us, those 2 series were unbelievably difficult to win. Unbelievable, especially the Rangers. Rangers had Rattel and Park and all these great players. And the only difference, I think, between the 2 teams, that was a great series, was we had Bobby Orr and they didn't.
That makes a difference.
Yeah.
And you're still, is this right, an advisor to the owner with the Bruins to this day?
Yeah, my title is Senior Advisor to the owner. And the only part of that title that really is true is the first word.
Senior. Well, when are you going to slow down, Harry?
Well, I've slowed down now quite a bit. I'm having trouble getting around. I'm not very mobile. Didn't get up to the celebrations for the 50th anniversary. They wanted me up there, and I couldn't. I having trouble. I walk with a cane and I go slow. So I'm slowed right down now. I keep up with the Bruins. That's about all I do.
Well, you got your name on the Stanley Cup 41 years apart. You got your name on for a second time in 2011. So how about that?
Yeah, well, I wasn't hands-on with the players very much in that, although they did talk to me a lot kind of privately. But I was involved, with the owner very closely during that was a great team too.
Harry, thank you so much for taking the time to share your memories, especially of the Whitby years with us and a little sprinkling of the rest of your career. We very, very much appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
Our second interview is with Carl Wetzel, who was in goal for Whitby in that opening game of the Russian tour, November 22nd, 1957. To give you an idea of the buzz in Toronto around that historic night, tickets for the game at Maple Leaf Gardens, more than 14,000 of them, sold out in a little more than an hour. Carl Wetzel's contribution to that evening is incredible for many reasons. Here's just two. First, he wasn't a member of the Whitby Dunlops. And second, he isn't Canadian. Carl, your OHA junior team was the Hamilton Tiger Cubs. How did it come to pass that you're between the pipe for the Dunnies when the Russians come calling?
Well, that's if you got time here, it's a long story. Sure. I was a member of the Dunnies for less than 24 hours. When I was with, I think it was 18 years old with Hamilton. And the night before the Dunnies were to play the Russians, my coach, I can't remember if he had called me or if I was down at the arena, but he said that you have to go to Toronto tomorrow because you're going to play for the Dunnies against the Russians. And of course, this build up for months about the first Russian team to come to Canada. And this was kind of dumped on my lap there. And of course, you're going to do it. But I can't recall if I left that night and stayed in the hotel overnight or if I left the next morning. But anyway, I got to Toronto and I didn't see anybody from the Dunnies. There wasn't any team meetings or team skate, and basically showed up in the dressing room before the game is the first time that I met any of the players. So it was a little bit, when you go into something, you like to really be prepared. And of course, I didn't, didn't know any of the Russian players, and a number of the Dunnies I knew through through the hockey news, through different things. But the one saving grace was they're just such a great bunch of guys. When I just kind of spent the day, I was kind of walking around Toronto. But I went in. I don't know if you've been in a situation when you're not prepared, it's unnerving, I would say. And it showed in the first few minutes when they scored 2 goals early and before I finally woke up and got with the program. I would add that my coach in junior said that John Henderson was the Dunnies goalie who was injured the day before the game. And we had played the Dunnies in an exhibition game the week before. And they were not able, they reached out to a number of senior goalies but everybody was pretty much committed to team play in that. So they weren't able to get somebody. And so John had recommended me. So that's how I ended up there.
You're all of 18 years old, skating onto the ice at Maple Leaf Gardens. More than 14,000 people in the stands. What was going through your mind?
You don't even notice the people. But I think probably was really incredible. I didn't have a pair of goalie pads on until I was 15 years old. I played all kinds of pond hockey and street hockey, and in Detroit there wasn't hardly any ice time. And I played as a 10th grader and 11th grader, just very limited ice time, but I practiced it. Everybody wanted, all the senior teams, the junior teams wanted goalies at practice. So I got plenty of ice time. And then as a senior in high school, I decided I'm going to commute to London, Ontario to play. They had a junior B team there. So I commuted from Detroit, which is about 120 miles. And that way I actually got to have some pretty good competition. But I commuted, I get back to Detroit at 7 a.m. at the Greyhound bus station, jump on the city bus with my equipment, and be at school at 8 o'clock.
And if that's not enough pressure, Foster Hewitt and Hockey Night in Canada are in the house. Were you aware that the game was on TV as well?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that was announced much ahead of time that it was going to be. Not obviously not the first game coast to coast, but just as like a hockey night in Canada, right? Yeah.
The broadcast didn't begin until midway through the second period, so the TV audience missed seeing the Moscow Selects going out to a 2-0 lead in the first couple of minutes. Now, what were you thinking?
What was I thinking?
Yeah.
Just, I better stop the next one. And then it was unlikely that something would happen, but they had dumped the puck in. And it was a race to the puck between myself and one of the Russian players. And you always in the nets, you got to make a commitment and go. And I think I kind of hesitated a little bit, and then I went.
Both uniforms are dark. There's a breakaway for the Russians, a race for the puck, and Wetzel came away out, as you saw, as the Russian stood by Novoshelov right in front of the net. Novoshelov was beaten to the puck. Wetzel came sliding out, as you saw, to break it up.
And I kind of went and spread eagled out, and I'm saying, but anyway, I got there first. So I think that moment there kind of brought me around. It was, I think it was, the fans were probably saying, "Oh my God, what's this guy doing?" But we came out good. We came out good in that.
How well were you coordinating with your new Dunlop teammates? You only played against them once, I think. You couldn't have known their individual styles very well.
We did play one game against them. And you read about the Whitby team quite a bit. And basically all as a goaltender, and I was pretty vocal. And what I would always communicate is what was going on in front of me. If a player is behind the net with the puck, telling them if there's a player coming down on them, or if there's two coming, or if there's somebody. And that always kept me in the game, to be talking. Didn't make any difference who was on the team. I would be telling them, what I saw.
The game ends. You and your Dunnies teammates are 7-2 victors. Is it all a blur what happened next with the post-game handshakes and how you celebrated afterward?
I don't recall what post-game. I know with the international, they always line up at the blue lines and then shake hands. I'm assuming we did that. Yeah, but then the locker room, everybody was celebrating in there. But I can't write. I was 18 years old. Whatever they went to celebrate, I didn't go with them. I think I just went back to the hotel room and got some sleep before I went back to Hamilton.
One more oddity about you participating in this game, representing Canada, and you were born in Detroit, Michigan. How about that?
Never thought about that until I don't know what time it was a bit later. And I thought, wow, yeah, how did that happen? Because it was just really, at that time, I was the only American playing in the junior hockey. There might have been one or two in Western Canada, I'm not sure. But what can I say? I was happy to be there.
Talk about dreams coming true. This Detroit boy grows up to play 2 games in net for the Red Wings during the 64-65 season. What do you remember about that?
The first game I went in was just very brief. And, back then there were just the 6 teams. And so it was something you always hoped to do. And I played just those 2 games with the Red Wings. And then the next year I ended up in Montreal when there were still 6 teams. And then I moved to Minnesota and played for the U.S. team. But I, as we were talking before, and I had mentioned in my high school days, I started my first time that I played hockey was 10th grade. About halfway through my senior year, I played 4 exhibition games with the Detroit Red Wings. I practiced with them most of my senior year, which was, back then it was what it was, I guess. But that was to me was really, really exciting.
As you mentioned, in 65-66, you're on the bench as the backup goalie in Montreal. You're there for 10 games. You didn't play, but you must have been a Habs good luck charm because they didn't lose any of those 10 games.
Right. I think that was Toe Blake, the first year that he had 2 goalies. So before they had 1 goalie dressed, and he didn't have to make a decision. So what Toe was doing, I think it went through the whole year. I'm not sure how far after that. But if you were in nets and you won or tied the game, you played the next night. And obviously it was not my luck to get a chance to play.
Were you secretly hoping that maybe you'd lose one of those games?
Well, secretly, yeah, real big secret. But back in the day there, guys were not going to, especially when there was just 6 goalies, you weren't going to get a chance to play. If you're in the minors, you didn't wear a mask because anybody in the NHL didn't. And I remember one game, I came back from Hamilton to Detroit, was where I grew up, and first game of the Stanley Cup playoffs, and Jimmy Skinner was the coach. He said, well, Carl, we have a goalie coming in from Hershey, which they did bring a spare goalie in for the playoffs. He said, he won't be here until game 2, so you'll be the backup tonight. And I think probably the same year that I played for the Dunnies. And Glenn Hall took a shot below his nose, opened up, I think he had 42 stitches, lost 4 teeth. They took him up into the dressing room, 45 minutes, stitched him up, and they held up the game all during that, and then back he went into the net. So, I mean, I didn't even think, maybe this is my chance, but a couple of things. Glenn got his job when Sawchuk got hurt.
Yeah.
Sawchuk got his job when Harry Lumley got hurt. So it was just one of the things. Guys played sick, hurt, if they could possibly get out there.
Again, as you mentioned, you make it back to the NHL with the expansion Minnesota North Stars, the first NHL expansion in 67-68. You play 5 games and you win 1. How cool was that?
That's what you're expecting to do. I think the first game, I think every game I played, it just allowed I think it was 3 goals pretty much every game. But I think I won 1, tied 1, and then lost 3. But you know, I was hoping I could have been out there more, for sure.
Not only did you play with the North Stars, you also played before and after with the South Stars, the minor league team. What was it like being with the North Stars, an expansion team where basically it's a group of guys that nobody really knows each other?
You know, hockey back then, that was the first year of expansion. And when there were just 6 teams, everybody in the league knew not only the players that are in the league, but they knew most of the minor league players. You know, it was just a real small, not select group, but just a small group. And you either read the hockey news, so you know, even if you hadn't met these guys, hadn't met up, you'd know who they were by reputation. So it wasn't like we say, like, hey, we never heard of you, don't recognize you. Somewhere along the line, you played against them or were a teammate.
You close out your career with another Minnesota franchise, the Minnesota Fighting Saints of the WHA. 1 game in 72-73. And then how come you called it a career?
Well, I think it was time to, get on with my education at that age. And that's why I moved to Minnesota to finish my college education, to play with the U.S. team. And then the North Stars came along. But, at that time, I think I must have been 32 years old. And I just thought it was time to either finish my education or get on with a career.
Let's dive a little deeper into your international hockey career as a proud member of the U.S. national team. You did in national competition distinguish yourself. What stories do you remember from those adventures?
I think that year in the 67 tournament in Vienna was a highlight for me. I was fortunate to have a very good tournament and was named the All-Star goalie in the tournament. And that was the only U.S. player in a world tournament to make an All-Star team. Not just a goalie, but any position. For I think about another 30 years later, the Russians automatically, and they should have with the great teams they had. But that year, Karl Brewer made the team, and I did, and the other 4 were Russians. And the Russians were not happy that they didn't get all 6 spots, but I was happy. That was very satisfying to me. I will say back we played when I was with that U.S. team. We played a tournament in Winnipeg against the Russians, Czechs, and Canadians before the tournament, the World Tournament. And the Russians, that was right in the heat of the Vietnam, and they were just so much, for us not so much, but for them there was a lot of very passionate, and they played in the first period about the 10-minute mark. They were in our zone pretty much all the time, and for a face-off, one of the referees backed up to our bench. And Johnny Mariucci tapped him on the shoulder and he said, "Could you throw a puck out there so my guys can play?" But John, it's but the next morning, I was so impressed with the way they played. It was incredible. And then the next morning, in the hotel, I sat down with a couple of the NHL scouts. And they asked me to join them, and I knew them. I won't mention names. They were talking, and they started to expound on what a bunch of robots the Russians were, because they had set plays, and they weren't very impressed. And I thought, wow. And then went to the World Tournament in Vienna, and there was just one NHL scout there. And I met him in the lobby of the hotel. And it was Scotty Bowman. He said, "Carl, these guys can play." So because he was always way ahead of his time in everything. I think Scotty was. He could see the what was going on.
Let's end where we began with the 1957 Whitney Dunlops versus the Moscow Selects. Did you have any conception at the time what a historic first international game like that would be in Canada?
I think the media, there was so much media coverage on it that you knew it was really special. That so did I, like people 55 years later, it's nice that you remembered me. I appreciate that. because there's a lot of people, Jack McCartan, who was a goaltender on the 60 gold medal team, is a good friend of mine. And he saw Paul had sent a video of me in that game. And Jack saw that. He says, "The hell were you doing there, Wetzel?" I said, "I never even heard of you." So, but it was really a good experience, to say the least.
Well, the last 55 minutes, you shut them out.
Yeah, 57 minutes and 10 seconds. Yeah.
But who's counting, right?
Yes. Didn't really know what to expect, but the guys, when we got down 2-0, that Dunny's team, they were a team. I think they just said, "Hey, this goalie's horseshit. We better get going here." I'm sure they didn't, but they just got it together and really got going. I work all the Minnesota Wild hockey games I host. We have an alumni lounge. I host that every game. So I keep busy. It keeps me young.
What do you do at the Wild game?
We have an alumni lounge that I host. Keep the beer warm or cold. Better keep it cold. And, open the wine bottles and make everybody feel welcome.
And how many of them know what you did back in 1957?
Zero. Nobody. Jack McCartan knows now, but no, my family. I hope that I can get a video of this here from you guys, and because I'd like to show my family, because I don't think I've ever told. We never talked about this. I thank you very much.
Our thanks once again to both Harry Sinden and Carl Wetzel. A Chicago Blackhawks scout, after the Dunlops 7-2 victory, predicted the Russians would not win a single game on their tour, adding that they weren't even as good as some junior A teams in Canada. Well, the Russian squad ended up winning 5 and tying 1 against just 2 losses in their 8-game tour. After bettering Kingston 4-2, the game story noted their, quote, dazzling speed, precision passing, and persistent forechecking. The team from Moscow concluded their tour by pasting the Ottawa Hull Junior Canadians 10-1. None other than the legendary Sam Pollock, then the Junior Canadians coach, summed up the game in 3 words, quote, "I'm simply amazed." We're fortunate, due to the connections of our friend Alex Braverman, to get a Russian player's perspective on that tour. This is a recent picture of Stanislav Petukov with Alex Ovechkin. The guy on the right may have scored 800 NHL goals, but it was the guy on the left who helped blaze a trail for Russians playing in North America. Our Alex Braverman translates a recorded interview with Stan.
Да, начинал я в хоккей с мячом.
Yeah, as many other players, he started with bandy and also tried the hockey on the grass first, but then love to hockey on ice was prevailing, and he started playing, and his life was given to the hockey, ice hockey.
Ну, я был крайний нападающий, правый крайний нападающий.
He said he was a right winger, and he had a good skating ability, good stick handling, and one of the strengths was near the net. He liked to tip the puck and work near the grease, and he would say today they would call him power forward. He had a good size, good weight, and good wrist shot. They didn't do the slap shot yet at that point, but wrist shot they practiced a lot, and he had a good one. And also he was good at physical aspect of play near the boards. He normally break 2 or 3 out during the game, and the sticks were in good quality, so they break a lot. And during the time of when they went to Canada, and when they had this chance to watch the game of professional, they not only admire the style of the game, and not only look at the technical principles of the game, but they also admire the equipment and hockey and skates and sticks and yeah. He didn't say that, but I also read about they bind skates somewhere from Canadians and paying big money for the skates because it was much better quality.
Ну, я бы сказал так, о Тарасове.
He come up with a system of the exercise and practicing tricks, and it would started with the easy one and go way up in intense, and stimulate the games and were very practical. His practice were very intriguing, and it will consume the attention. And it remind very much game situations. He was very tough guy with big demands, with heavy demands. He would say if a player able to keep up at the practice, then he would play for him.
Конечно, это, в общем-то,
he was very proud of to find out he's gonna represent his country and he's going to Canada. And it was first European trip too to Canada, so they were very proud. They had a chance to represent the new hockey school or old world hockey, what they call it, in Canada. They were also afraid a little bit because they knew the strain of the Canadian teams, and they knew it's going to be tough games. But they went there with good emotion, and they were lucky and happy to be there. During this Canadian trip, if he remember anything, going to restaurants. He said he remembered one of the restaurants they visited was they only paid like $1 and it was all you can eat buffet and it was full of food. He remembered the big steaks they had for dinner at one point. They were so big and soft. They would cut the starch from the steaks before they ate them, and food was very good. And, he remember one of the funny episode about this trip. He remember sitting at the game and about the game was going a good flow of the game, but 3 rows below them it was a woman. But as soon as the fight break up, she jump up, start waving with her hands and got emotional. So this was more important for her than game. As soon as the referee did control the situation and game got forward, she sit down and start sleeping again. And some time pass from that game they watch, but the fights came to arena in Russia. The nice become popular too. For the fans, it's kind of entertaining.
Во время нашего турне
During the tour, around Canada, it also was a big official delegation there, and they were talking about nickel, which is a precious metal. After one of the games, they got the gifts from the Canadians, and these gifts were made it from that metal, nickel. Every time they would come to the arena where they play, they were greeted by a lot of a big crowd of fans, and very often they heard the Russian language, Russian language in the crowd, and it's some of the immigrants who came to Canada before.
Да, в одном из, я вот сейчас
He doesn't remember exactly which town, but he remember probably it was Ottawa. They were invited to embassy, Russian embassy in Canada.
видимо, это было в Оттаве. Наверное. Вообще это акклиматизация, это влияет очень.
Yeah, more likely jet lag were a reason for this score, and probably it would be different. I know from how my conversation with different people, normally when they come over, day number 3 or day number 4 of the trip is most difficult as far as the changing the that's
time zones.
Yeah. Everybody could learn from these games, and Canadians would probably pick up the ice skating ability, the style of the ice skating, and combination play. And Soviets would like to, learn about the forechecking and the slap shots, which wasn't used before, the different combinations, styles and types of game. And we also noticed how Canadian players enjoyed the games. They had fun during the game, not only hard work. It was giving them pleasure to play. And even when they did hit each other and or other player, they did it with a smile, and it was just a game for them. And we told them thank you. No, we didn't take it. We take it right away. We didn't offend it.
Наше преимущество было это скоростной.
The advantage of Russian team or Soviet team was good skating ability, combination style of the game, but they did they were in worse as far as the physicality of the game and different aspect of the game. But as the time go and with because of the series like that and series after that, the friendly games and friendly tournaments, Soviet team will learn from the Canadians and pick up the different aspect of the game, and that's what allowed in the future for Russians to come to NHL.
Да. И сейчас наши хоккеисты российские,
And
которые
with time go, our players, the Soviet players, become good enough to play NHL, and now everybody knows about them. Not to mention Alex Ovechkin, who is chasing the Gretzky record, and everybody talking about him and know him. We're also happy because of Russian goalies doing pretty well in NHL now, and one of the leaders in today's game.
все-таки наш президент Федерации хоккея Владислав Третьяк.
He said, as a veteran of the hockey, and he think because of Tretyak and his ability to coach his school is that what helped Russian goalie too.
Конечно.
At that time, he never thought about him playing in NHL because he still was a young player and he had to work hard to improve and establish himself in the Dynamo club where he played, and also national team to get on the roster of national team. At that point, he didn't dream about NHL, and he never thought the Russian players would be allowed to play there. So.
Я хочу сказать, что главный вывод вот из этой поездки на родину хоккея.
One of the main things they pick up from that tour was this kind of friendly games would help a lot, not everybody to get to know each other, and future communication, keep the line open for future communication.
A while back on Hockey Time Machine, the great broadcaster Brian McFarland told us how he would lug a big, heavy tape recorder with him, which he used to record over the years a whole bunch of amazing interviews. One of those was with Sid Smith, player coach for the Dunlops for 2 seasons, 1957 through 1959. Brian has been kind enough to let us share some clips from his interview with Smith about the Dunlops in Oslo, Norway at the 1958 World Championships. The first clip regards pep talks.
When we were getting into the tournament, Blair had so many telegrams from prominent people in Canada, like Lester Pearson and Smythe and politicians and hockey executives and everything. And he used to, I'd give the pep talk, and then he'd save one of these telegrams to read just before we went out on the ice, and made it very emotional, but it sort of got the guys up, But we had an experience after we'd won it, and the guys were all kidding me about my pep talks, skate fast, shoot hard, and don't get caught in the corners, and Blair reading the telegrams and all this. So we got into Switzerland for a game, and we had a guy named Connie Broden who we acquired from Montreal Canadiens. He was really a humorous guy, and so I said, okay, you guys just giving it to us, you take over tonight. So Connie says, all right, I'll give the pep talk. And he says, no, skate fast, shoot hard, don't get caught in the corners. And he says, I got a telegram here from Mrs. McKenzie back in Kitchener. And that's Jack McKenzie's wife who played for us. And he says, she was out doing the weekend grocery shopping, and amongst some of the groceries she bought was some Swiss cheese. And she got home and unpacked them, and the Swiss cheese was bad. Now he says, these are the bastards that made it. Now get out there. I thought that was a great pep talk.
Paul Patsku is back with us. And Paul, as I play the rest of these clips, feel free to jump in with any commentary you want to share.
Well, I want to talk about Sid Smith. He was a star player in the NHL with the Leafs for many, many years. All-star, captain, cup winner, and everything. And then he ends up a player coach with Whitby, which is fortunate for that team. So he came from a different world. He was pep talks. He listened to Hap Day and people like that give him pep talks, and now he's dealing with a different type of player, and something worked.
Well, as coach, Smith also had to contend with Roy Edwards, a 20-year-old homesick goalie.
Roy Edwards, he fell in really great. But you know, the funny thing is, when you get younger players, we had a bit of a problem with him because he was young and he started to get homesick because we were away for 9 weeks, and he had a girlfriend and he started to miss her, and you know, we had to really talk to him and keep him in, mentally keep him in shape.
Yeah, well, 9 weeks, but that's because it was a Ren Blair. They didn't want to fly, so they took the boat over, which took out a week on one side, a week on another week going back, and so yeah, they were gone a long time, and I can see them getting homesick. Not many people visited Europe back in those days. We're talking 1957, so yeah, we're a little bit different.
The 58 championship games were played on outdoor rinks in Oslo. So when it snowed, well, listen.
You had to play in any weather conditions, whether it rained, sleet, hail, whatever. And the first day of the tournament, we were scheduled to play East Germany, and just last minute they dropped out. So we went over to watch Russia play Poland, and it snowed. You wouldn't believe. They scraped the ice at one stage there, or twice between the second and third period. And when they came out to play, there was a coating of ice, you know, maybe, or snow, I mean, about an inch or so thick, and you just see an object sliding underneath, and you see a bunch of men chasing that. It looked like, you know, a rabbit, sort of just, and it really, you know, a thing like that could have been an upset for us. You know, some team could have beaten us. But it was really a strange thing to watch, you know, a puck sliding under the snow and a bunch of guys running after it.
They didn't have puck tracking back in those days.
No, not even a roof for the arena. But I always remember Frank Bonello was a center on that Whitby team, who later coached and managed the Marlies, and also ran central scouting for the NHL. He says after the first period against the Russians, it's freezing out, and the Canadian team players, they go into the dressing room to get warm. They take a look outside, and there's an adjacent ice skating rink besides the one they're playing in. And the Russians, instead of going into the dressing room to warm up, they went and practiced on the other rink. And Frank said, do you think that didn't affect our psyche a bit? It sure did. They just didn't know what they were getting into when they're playing them. But yeah, that's I like that story because it just shows how different things were back then between Canadian and Russian hockey.
Another difference, and as you alluded to, Whitby did win the championship for Canada. And after the final game, there was a reception, and an aspect of that reception also pointed up the differences between the Europeans and the Canadians.
What kind of a party did you have after a reception when you got home?
Well, that was exciting too. I mean, they all, you know, this is where I learned about, I guess, the difference between professionalism and playing in Europe was that, you know, they get together after. When a game is finished, it's done, and there's no hard feelings, and they get together and they have drinks together. And, you know, I sat there thinking, geez, you know, if I'd have lost that tournament, I don't know whether I could have been doing that. And that's an awful thing to say. You know, it is. But, I mean, that's the way we're sort of brought up. You win or else. And they don't look at it that way, or they didn't at that time. I think maybe now they might, but it was a one big get-together party, and I was drinking vodka with the Russians, and we were all toasting each other, and it was really a good experience.
Yeah. See, he came from a different world, professional hockey to international hockey, and yeah, I can imagine that party would have been fun. Yeah.
Paul, as you mentioned, Sid Smith played more than 600 games with the Maple Leafs, and at one time he was their captain as well. He played in the 40s and 50s. He recalled to Brian how he almost chose a different path rather than coming to Whitby.
It worked out fine, except you know, I look back and I had a chance at the time Whitby's job was there to be traded to Detroit. To play with Gordie Howe, you know, and I had to scratch my head and say, hey, should I do this? You know, you got a young family, and I didn't know whether to move to Detroit, but sometimes I often think of what it would be like to have played with them. Yeah. That's what they wanted me for. Lindsay had gone to Chicago, and like, see, they were looking for a left winger.
Yeah. Oh, that would have been something.
Yeah, I guess, you know, it was a decision I had to make, so I don't regret it in a way, although I do I do wish I would have been able to play with them.
Well,
You know.
how come after Whitby experience, playing coach and a big success like that, how come you didn't coach in the NHL?
I didn't have any urge to coach, Brian. No, I didn't. I didn't really. I've never really gave it any thought, and I didn't. I didn't really have the desire. You know.
Oh, Sid Smith, he ran the Old Timers for many, many years, and a lot of those Old Timers, former teammates with the Leafs and other teams, and they were so good that they actually played against the Canadian national team in the 60s and actually beat the Canadian national team. And these are retired NHL players. So he continued that for many, many years. And I remember going and watching the Old Timers play, and Sid Smith and Harry Watson and Cal Gardner and Ivan Irwer and the rest of them. It was pretty good hockey.
Whitby, who were the 57 Allen Cup champions, the champs of senior hockey in Canada, as I understand it, they were fairly dominant at the 58 World Championships. What do you think the key was to their success in running through a lot of good European squads?
Well, they had a good team. Whitby had some pretty good players. Bobby Addersley, who later became a mayor. Charlie Burns, who was a former Marley, and he got injured and didn't play for a bit. And then he joined the Whitby team, and he actually had a long career with Detroit and Boston and California and other teams. The teams are pretty good players. And Harry Sinden was no slouch on defense. And they had Connie Broden, who was on loan from Montreal, and, good goaltending. And I guess Sid Smith was a good coach. And remember, Ren Blair was the general manager, and Ren Blair's, notable for the expansion Minnesota North Stars and other teams. So, good leadership and good players.
Well, I guess so, because earlier we quoted Sam Pollock, who was also assistant director of the Montreal Canadiens farm system. Pollock said before the Worlds that it would take an NHL level team to beat the Russians. We're going to close the show, Paul, with some photos of the parade held for the Dunnies on their return home, their triumphant return. For those of us, especially those of us in the States, maybe we can relate to it as like a high school football championship. But can you describe in Canada how much of a community's identity and how much civic pride is tied up in the accomplishments like the ones that the 57-58 Whitby Dunlops had?
Well, as I mentioned, it put the city on the map. It was a small town, but the players were close to the fans. The parade speaks for itself. They've had reunions ever since that, up to a few years ago. It shows you how close the team was and the players with the fans. So it was small town Canada. It's a big deal to them. This happened again in '59 when Canada won again, and that was in Belleville. And then in '61, the Trail of Smoke Eaters, same sort of thing. Small town, a lot of players from that area, and it's celebrated by the people, and it made them proud.
And I'm glad that because you found that footage and helped organize this panel of guests and the footage that we were able to show on this program, that we've honored that memory 65 years later.
Yeah, we should honor it. It's not just NHL teams that were part of hockey history, senior teams, junior teams, and other teams as well. So I'm glad that people can know about them and their accomplishments, which were plenty.
As always, Paul, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for watching. We'll see you next time on Hockey Time Machine.